At 3:17 in the morning on June 5, 1942, a classified signal reached London that did not match the reality Britain was living in. Commander James Whitfield, the duty officer at the Admiralty, broke the seal expecting routine intelligence from the Pacific. Shipping movements, carrier sightings, another report describing retreat, delay, or loss. Instead, the message forced him to stop breathing for a moment. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers confirmed destroyed. 1 American carrier lost. Enemy naval force in retreat. Whitfield had spent nearly 2 decades in naval intelligence. He understood carrier doctrine, air group strength, and the unforgiving FF math of naval aviation. 7 months earlier, Japan had deployed 6 fleet carriers to Pearl Harbor and humiliated the world's most powerful navies in a single morning. Now the Americans were claiming they had eliminated 2/3 of that force in one battle. Whitfield checked the decryption again. Then he checked it a 3rd time. The Admiralty building was dark under blackout conditions, its corridors washed in dim red light. Officers moved quietly, exhausted men managing a war that Britain was not winning anywhere quickly. Whitfield carried the message down 3 flights of stairs to the secure office of the First Sea Lord. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound read the report slowly. Then again. Around him, wall maps told a brutal story. In the Atlantic, convoy routes were marked with losses that exceeded replacement. Merchant ships burned faster than British yards could build new hulls. In the Mediterranean, British forces were being pushed backward month after month in North Africa. And in the Indian Ocean, the map showed something worse than defeat. It showed absence. Singapore had fallen in February. 60,000 British troops had surrendered in what would later be called the Empire's worst military disaster. The battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse lay on the seabed, sunk by Japanese aircraft that had proven battleships obsolete in a single engagement. The Eastern Fleet had retreated westward twice in 4 months, chased by the same Japanese carriers now reported destroyed. Pound set the telegram down and stared at the Pacific. If the American report was accurate, it meant more than a victory. It meant Japan's carrier dominance had finally been broken. It meant the threat to British India might be postponed. It meant Britain might survive long enough to keep fighting. Or it meant Britain had become entirely dependent on American naval power operating oceans away. Pound drafted a short message to Winston Churchill, who was in Washington meeting President Roosevelt. American carriers report decisive engagement in the Central Pacific. 4 Japanese carriers claimed destroyed. Confirmation pending. Then he ordered his staff to begin the calculations. Because if the Americans had truly done this, the balance of the war had shifted. The only question was whether it had shifted in Britain's favor, or revealed just how far beyond Britain's reach survival had become. For Britain, the problem was never courage. It was arithmetic. By mid-1942, the Royal Navy was responsible for 3 oceans at once. The Atlantic demanded constant convoy protection against U-boats that were sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. The Mediterranean consumed fleets to keep North Africa supplied and Malta alive. And the Indian Ocean, once secure by default, had become a vacuum after Japan's rapid advance. On paper, Britain still possessed a powerful navy. In reality, it was stretched to the breaking point. Fleet carriers were the most critical asset of the new war, and Britain had too few of them to cover everything that mattered. 5 operational carriers could not protect trade routes, support land campaigns, deter Japanese expansion, and counter German naval threats simultaneously. Every deployment solved one problem by creating another somewhere else. The fall of Singapore exposed this limit brutally. The base had been designed to project British naval power across Southeast Asia. Instead, it collapsed before a carrier force could even arrive. When Japanese aircraft sank Prince of Wales and Repulse days later, it confirmed what many officers already feared. Surface ships without air cover were liabilities, not assets. From that moment on, Britain no longer controlled events east of Suez. The Eastern Fleet withdrew again and again, always one step ahead of Japanese carrier groups. Each retreat preserved ships, but conceded influence. Every mile westward reduced Britain's ability to defend India, Australia, and the sea lanes connecting them. This was the context in which the American telegram landed. If 4 Japanese fleet carriers were truly gone, it would not merely reduce enemy strength. It would change the equation Britain could not solve alone. Carrier warfare was not linear. Remove enough carriers, and the enemy's entire operational tempo collapsed. But British planners were cautious. They had seen false optimism before. Early war reports were often exaggerated, confused, or incomplete. Fog of war distorted reality. A damaged carrier could be reported sunk. A temporary withdrawal mistaken for defeat. Hope was dangerous when built on assumptions. So the Admiralty did what it always did. It waited for confirmation. Signals intelligence, submarine sightings, reconnaissance, anything that could verify whether the Americans had truly achieved what Britain could not. Because if the claim proved false, nothing changed. But if it was true, then Britain's survival no longer depended on holding every ocean at once. It depended on whether the United States could now do what Britain no longer could. And that realization was both relieving and terrifying. What the Americans had done at Midway was not simply defeat a fleet. They had broken a system. Japan's naval strategy depended on carriers operating as a unified striking force. Aircraft carriers were not independent weapons. They were the core around which everything else revolved: screening ships, submarines, reconnaissance, logistics, and timing. Remove enough carriers, and the entire structure collapsed. At Midway, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were lost in the span of hours. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Each represented years of construction, trained air crews, and combat experience that Japan could not replace quickly, or at all. More damaging than the ships themselves was the loss of veteran pilots and deck crews. Japan's carrier arm was not just reduced. It was hollowed out. British analysts understood this immediately. Carrier warfare was not about numbers alone. It was about tempo. Before Midway, Japan dictated where and when battles occurred. Its carriers could strike, withdraw, refuel, and strike again before opponents could react. That freedom of movement had driven British fleets out of the Indian Ocean and kept Allied commanders permanently on the defensive. Midway ended that freedom. From that point forward, Japanese carrier operations became cautious. Reconnaissance gaps widened, air cover thinned, risk tolerance collapsed. Instead of forcing battles, Japan began avoiding them, husbanding what strength remained. For Britain, this mattered more than geography. It meant the Indian Ocean was no longer immediately threatened by a decisive carrier raid. It meant shipping lanes might survive without constant fleet withdrawal. it meant Australia and India were no longer exposed to sudden isolation. But it also meant something else. The center of gravity in the naval war had shifted decisively toward the United States. Britain had not lost its navy, but it had lost the ability to act independently at global scale. From now on, the Pacific War would be shaped by American decisions, American priorities, and American capacity to replace losses at an industrial rate Japan could not match. Midway did not end the war, but it ensured that Japan would fight it while falling backward. And Britain, watching from a map room thousands of miles away, understood that the future of the empire was now tied to events it no longer controlled directly. That realization carried relief and unease. For Britain, the meaning of Midway unfolded slowly. At first, it was relief. Japanese carrier power had been checked. The immediate danger to India and the Indian Ocean receded. The Eastern Fleet could breathe again, no longer forced to retreat at the first hint of enemy carriers. But as planners began updating charts and projections, another truth emerged. Britain could no longer act alone. Before the war, the Royal Navy had been the global stabilizer by default. Wherever British ships sailed, balance followed. That assumption had died quietly between Singapore and Midway. What remained was a navy still skilled and dangerous, but no longer sufficient to shape outcomes across the world's oceans without support. Midway confirmed that reality. The battle was decisive not because Britain had participated, but because Britain had not needed to. The United States had detected, planned, struck, and absorbed losses independently. American industry, training pipelines, and command structure had functioned exactly as intended under extreme pressure. British officers understood what that meant. From this point forward, major naval initiative in the Pacific belonged to Washington. Britain would contribute where possible: bases, intelligence, experience. But it would no longer set the tempo. Strategy would be coordinated, not led. This shift was uncomfortable. The alliance had always been necessary, but necessity had now hardened into reliance. Britain's survival depended on American carriers holding sea lanes thousands of miles away. Decisions made in Pearl Harbor and Washington would ripple directly into the security of British India, Australia, and imperial trade routes. Churchill grasped this faster than most. In private conversations, he acknowledged that the war Britain was fighting could no longer be won on British terms alone. Victory would come through coalition power, dominated by American production and reach. Britain's role was to endure long enough to remain relevant within that coalition. Midway made endurance possible, but it also made hierarchy unavoidable. British planners recalculated deployments accordingly. Resources were concentrated where Britain could still influence outcomes: North Africa, the Atlantic, and later Europe. The Pacific became an American theater with British interests rather than British control. This was not surrender of sovereignty, it was adaptation. And in war, adaptation decides survival as surely as firepower. Midway had broken Japanese momentum. It had also clarified the shape of the Allied future. And that future no longer revolved around London alone. Midway did not hand Britain victory. It gave Britain time. That distinction mattered. Time was the one resource the British Empire no longer possessed in abundance by 1942. Manpower was strained. Shipyards were overworked. Aircraft production lagged behind losses. Every month, without a catastrophic defeat, became a month in which survival remained possible. The collapse of Japanese carrier strength changed the tempo of the war in the East. Large-scale naval raids into the Indian Ocean became unlikely. The threat of a sudden strike against India or Australia faded from immediate concern. Shipping routes that had been considered untenable weeks earlier could be used again, cautiously but deliberately. This breathing room allowed Britain to make hard choices without panic. Convoy escorts were redistributed more rationally. Fleets could remain in place instead of retreating preemptively. The Eastern Fleet no longer had to assume that a superior enemy carrier force would appear without warning. Risk remained, but it was calculable now. Most importantly, Britain could refocus. North Africa demanded attention. Rommel's forces threatened Egypt and the Suez Canal, the artery connecting Britain to its remaining empire. Without control of Suez, Britain's strategic position would collapse completely. Midway ensured that resources diverted to North Africa would not simultaneously invite disaster in the Indian Ocean. Industrial planning benefited as well. Shipyards could prioritize repair and replacement rather than emergency construction. Aircraft production schedules stabilized. Training pipelines functioned without constant interruption. None of this would have been possible if Japan retained freedom of action at sea. British commanders understood that Midway had not eliminated the Japanese threat. It had postponed it. But postponement was enough. War was not won by avoiding danger forever, but by managing it long enough to shift the balance elsewhere. The psychological effect mattered too. For the first time since 1940, Britain saw a major Axis offensive halted decisively, not by attrition, but by defeat. Confidence returned quietly. Not optimism, but belief that the enemy could be beaten under the right conditions. Midway did not solve Britain's problems. It narrowed them. And in a war defined by overextension, narrowing the problem space was survival. The loss of 4 carriers was only the surface damage. What truly broke Japan after Midway was not steel, it was people. Carrier warfare depended on experience. Pilots were not interchangeable. Deck crews were not replaceable by numbers alone. Each Japanese carrier lost at Midway took with it an ecosystem of skills that had taken years to build and could not be recreated quickly. Japan's naval aviation training system was built for quality, not speed. Before the war, pilots trained for years. Standards were unforgiving. Attrition during training was accepted as the price of excellence. This produced some of the finest naval aviators in the world, but it left no margin for mass loss. Midway erased that margin in a single day. Veteran pilots, squadron leaders, and instructors were lost together. The men who trained the next generation died alongside the men they had trained. Replacement programs could expand on paper, but the depth of experience was gone. American losses hurt, but they were survivable. The United States trained pilots by the thousands. Its industrial system assumed attrition and planned for it. Aircraft production replaced losses faster than Japan could repair damage. Training pipelines expanded rather than collapsed under pressure. This imbalance widened every month after Midway. Japanese carriers that survived the battle operated with reduced air groups. New pilots arrived with fewer hours, less combat exposure, and limited deck landing experience. Their effectiveness declined. Their survival rates fell further, accelerating the downward spiral. British analysts saw the pattern clearly. This was not a setback Japan could fix with courage or improvisation. It was a structural failure. The carrier arm that had terrorized the Pacific in 1941 and early 1942 could no longer regain dominance because the system that sustained it had been destroyed. From this point on, Japan fought defensively at sea. It conserved carriers. It avoided risk. It reacted instead of initiating. Each loss became harder to replace, each victory less decisive. Momentum, the true currency of naval war, shifted permanently. Midway was the last time Japan chose the battlefield. After that, it fought on battlefields chosen by others. With the immediate threat in the east reduced, Britain did what it had always done best under pressure. It reorganized. Midway allowed British planners to redraw priorities without fear that the map would change overnight. The empire could not fight everywhere at once, but now it no longer had to pretend otherwise. Strategic focus narrowed, and with it came clarity. The Atlantic remained non-negotiable. Convoys still carried Britain's survival across gray, dangerous waters. U-boats continued to sink ships at alarming rates. Escort groups expanded. New tactics were refined. Resources once held in reserve for a potential Japanese strike were reassigned to keep food, fuel, and troops moving. In the Mediterranean, pressure intensified. North Africa became the center of gravity. Rommel's forces threatened Egypt and the Suez Canal, and Britain committed fully to stopping them. Ships, aircraft, and experienced commanders were redirected south. Midway made that possible. Without fear of carrier raids in the Indian Ocean, the Royal Navy could finally accept risk elsewhere. This shift paid off. Within months, the balance in North Africa turned. Axis forces stalled, then retreated. The initiative passed to the Allies, setting conditions for later operations in Italy and southern Europe. These victories did not trace directly to Midway, but they depended on the space it created. The Pacific, meanwhile, became an American responsibility in practice as well as theory. Britain contributed intelligence, bases, and experience, but leadership and mass belonged to the United States. This division of labor was not formalized in speeches. It emerged from necessity. Britain lacked the capacity to project decisive power there, and the Americans now possessed it. Churchill understood the bargain. Britain would focus on holding and advancing where it could still shape outcomes. America would fight where only American scale could succeed. Together, the alliance gained coherence that had been impossible when everyone was reacting to crisis. Midway had not simplified the war. It had made it manageable. And for a nation fighting at the limits of endurance, manageability was the difference between survival and collapse. History often compresses meaning into place names. Midway is remembered as a naval battle in the Pacific, aircraft, carriers, and a turning point at sea. But its real impact reached far beyond the water where it was fought. It reshaped decisions made in rooms thousands of miles away by people who never saw the smoke rise from burning decks. For Britain, Midway was not about victory celebrations. It was about survival math finally making sense. Until that moment, the British Empire had been reacting, shifting fleets, abandoning positions, retreating to avoid annihilation. Strategy had been dominated by fear of what Japan might do next. Midway removed that uncertainty. It did not end the threat, but it bounded it. Bounded threats can be managed. Once Japan lost the ability to strike decisively across oceans, Britain regained the ability to plan. Not optimistically, not boldly, but rationally. Resources could be allocated. Risks could be chosen instead of imposed. The war became something that could be shaped rather than merely endured. This mattered in ways that never appeared on battle maps. Convoys reached ports that would have been abandoned. Shipyards repaired instead of replaced. Commanders took calculated risks, knowing they would not be punished instantly by carrier raids from nowhere. Allied cooperation matured into coordination instead of emergency response. Midway also clarified something uncomfortable. The future of the war would not be decided by Britain alone. American industry, American training capacity, and American naval reach had become the decisive force. Britain remained vital, but no longer central everywhere at once. The alliance survived because each partner accepted what it could and could not do. Midway made that acceptance unavoidable. For Japan, the consequences were irreversible. The loss of carriers and experienced crews was not a setback. It was a ceiling placed permanently on ambition. From that point forward, Japanese strategy contracted. Initiative vanished. Defense replaced offense. Every operation became an attempt to slow a tide that could no longer be turned. For Britain, that contraction meant space. Space to fight in North Africa. Space to hold the Atlantic. Space to prepare for the long return to Europe. The battle itself lasted days. Its consequences lasted years. Midway did not end the war. It did not save Britain by itself. It did not guarantee Allied victory. What it did was simpler and more decisive. It changed who could decide what happened next. And in a global war, that shift mattered more than any single victory.